we were delighted with Walter because he put plaques everywhere. He's the only person that did so.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yes. We've plaques here, we've plaque in the vault, and we've a plaque down the
which is good for the historian, in other words.
Yes, yeah, fair dues to him.
Right.
Well, Mrs. Burke was a lovely old lady who you could leave a pram in the kitchen and she'd sort of look after the baby for you.
But when they got older...
And then when they were older, it was just wonderful to have all this space to run around.
You could lose them, couldn't you? Easily?
Well, that was sometimes rather nice, wasn't it?
And then I saw this disgusting rum cocktail with a cherry in the rum, and it was called a Packenhams, so I thought maybe the story is true.
Well, it must be. Well, how else would they have got the name in the rum? Well, we'll leave it there because it can be an unsavoury story, I suppose. I suppose for the purpose of clarity, to guide travellers, to have an efficient postal service, for all sorts of sound administrative reasons really, it's sensible that every place should have an officially recognised name. It's also an important aspect of local identity, of course, to be able to tell people where you come from. But in settling on a particular name, it's also important, I think, to retain alternative versions where they exist, because within each one of those names there's a story, a slice of history or topography, some clue as to the origins, the character and even the language of the inhabitants of that place in centuries past. The people who live in the place that I'm in today were wise enough to do just that. Welcome then to Kinturk, to Ballinagross and to the town of Castlepollard in the north of County Westmeath. You'd be going back to the reign of Elizabeth I to find the earliest of a succession of Pollards who put their stamp on this place. He would have been Captain Nicholas Pollard, who was granted lands here in Westmeath in return for his services to the Crown when he fought with the Earl of Essex during the 9 Years' War. Then there was Walter Pollard, who married into the Anglo-Norman Nugent family, who built the church in 1672 and was given the right to hold the weekly market and the 4 fairs per annum, which helped establish the nascent village of Castlepollard. Jump forward to the early 19th century and William Dutton Pollard was laying out the foundations of the handsome and commodious town around the central green that you see today. The pre-existing townland names of Kinturk, meaning the Boar's Head, and Ballinagross, meaning the town of the cross, were retained and continue to be used right up to the present day. Thus the Pollards built Kinturk Manor House and Domain, while the church is referred to as Ballinagross Church. Mind you, in keeping with that local tradition of never using one name where two will do, it's also known as Killafree Church. I have that on the authority of local historian and walking encyclopedia Bill Ryan, who probably knows more about the seed, breed and generation of neighbouring landlord families such as the Dillons, Duttons, Chewits, Packenhams and Pollards than they know themselves.
This church was originally known as the Church of Ballinagross.
Right. You had a different name for it when we first
Yeah, it's called Killafree.
Killafree Church,
yeah,
right.
Known as Killafree. Why, we don't know. But it has always been known as Killafree.
Everything around here seems to have several names.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, Castlepollard has a few names as
right,
well.
But Castlepollard was also known as Ballinagross as well.
It was.
Or the area around here is known as that.
Yeah, Ballinagross is what the town was called, sometimes on the signs, you know.
Right. But the plaque behind us on the wall tells us firmly that it was Walter Pollard.
Yes.
So he built the
God
church.
Bless him. Yes.
Built the church.
Well, he claims the building of it, but Walter wasn't slow. Like Walter, we were delighted with Walter because he put plaques everywhere. He's the only person that did so.
Right.
You know what I mean? We've plaques here, we've plaque in the vault, and we've a plaque down the
which is good for the historian, in other words.
Yes,
right.
Fair dues to him.
Right.
You know, we get dates, so we do. 1672.
Would you say it was Walter then, more than any other Pollard who actually
very much.
Put the town in the map?
But what I'm also saying is that there was probably 2 Walters.
So could it be a son and a grandson?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. The second Walter. This Walter was built this in 1672, but Walter was kind of an MP for Westmeath. For Westmeath, in fact, and he was the High Sheriff of Westmeath, and he died in 1712. Right. So it's a long span there, so I think there was 2 Walters.
Right.
And I'm confusing you, so I am now.
Right, no.
The important Walter was the man that built this, and that got the grant of the fairs, the 2 fairs per year.
And the name of the town, Castlepollard, is, we know it refers to the Pollard family.
Correct.
Whichever one it was, whichever Walter it was, in fact, right. The shape of it as it is today, it's a rather handsome town. Built around this green, and it's kind of a classic village style almost, really, isn't it?
Yeah, very much. It was, well, you'd know it in the north, it's triangle kind of.
Yes,
It's
yes.
called the Green, but in fact, if you look at it, it's almost triangular.
It's
in a sense.
triangular.
You know?
Words,
Yeah.
right.
And the fairs were very important. They were 2-day. Even back in the 1670s, it was a 2-day affair. Do you know what I mean? When they got the grant of the fairs, it was May the 10th, May the 11th, and
Yes.
September the 20th and 21st.
Right.
Made Castlepollard kind of the market town for the hinterland, for the entire area. And gradually then, we say like inns developed.
So the town takes off in a life of its own, more or less, I would suppose. You know.
Yeah. There was a William Dutton Pollard,
Right.
who in William Dutton Pollard, now he married twice, that's irrelevant. But in 1821 or so, he went on a grand tour for a year. He had just got married and he went on a grand tour.
Right.
And while he was away, his house, Pollard, or Kinturk Mansion, or Kinturk House, was remodelled completely, okay? And then what he did was he started to remodel the town. Having remodelled his house, or changed his house completely,
Right.
he then built the market house. He kind of helped to create a fever hospital, the first in Westmeath. He set up a savings bank, the first again in Westmeath. This is William Dutton Pollard now,
Right,
who died he died young actually in a sense. But it was he who kind of created the landlord town in a sense,
I see.
between the 1820s and the 1840s.
Right. The 1820s was a great period in Irish history for rebuilding. You'll find that
Yes, that's true,
won't you,
yeah.
all over the place. There was certainly a big spurt. You know, I suppose it was after the Napoleonic Wars are over and so on.
Yes, and after the 1799 rebellion,
Yes,
1798,
yes.
there was a kind of a sense of security. Once the Act of Union came in,
Yeah.
the kind of rebellion seemed to recede, or the idea of it.
Right,
You know, and they began to. They didn't have to concentrate on defence.
They built more confident
Yes,
towns and
yeah.
things like that. I think that was the
Yeah.
case as well.
And of course, then their wealth had to, or there was kind of a prestige to having kind of the best town in the area.
Yes,
The
yes.
landlords kind of got a certain prestige from it, possibly.
Right.
You know, as well as that, they were genuinely improving landlords. This man William I was telling you about, he was very good now for the cholera. Cholera was a regular affliction in small, in lots of towns. So it was,
Yes.
And he was very. That's why he set up the fever hospital. He paid for the whitewash for all the houses to try and prevent the cholera from kind of getting a hold
I see.
in the 1830s. And he was a good landlord. We were lucky in the sense that both the Pollards and the Packenhams actually were quite good landlords, both of them.
Concerned with the welfare of the people who
Yeah,
lived
very
in their
much.
estates.
Yeah,
Right.
you don't hear talks of mass evictions or, attempts
Yeah.
to shoot them or, no, they were good.
It's rare enough to find a local historian in Ireland uttering the words landlord and good in the same breath. But Bill Ryan's regard for both the Pollards and the Packenhams, who still live nearby incidentally, is delivered with obvious enthusiasm. He was also insistent I make reference to the plaque on the town hall commemorating one of the area's most famous sons, Michael Joseph Kennedy, who had a distinguished career as one of the longest-serving TDs ever. Close by on the green is a sculpture inspired by the legend of the Children of Lir, which is closely associated with Tullynally Castle, home of the aforementioned Packenham family, to whom we'll be paying a visit shortly. Tullynally translates as the Hill of the Swan, and it's not the only stately home here whose name was derived from myth and legend. The Pollards called their house Kinturk, meaning the head of the wild boar, and that's a reference to the story of Finn McCool and Diarmid and Grania. Grania was about to marry Finn, but eloped instead with Diarmid. An enraged Finn pursued them round the country for 15 years, but eventually he made an uneasy peace with Diarmid, whom he then invited to go hunting with the Fianna. They chased a wild boar all the way to this hill near Castlepollard, where Diarmid was gored by the boar's massive tusks.
So when Finn came across Diarmid, he lay dying from the wounds inflicted by the tusks of the huge boar. But Finn, we're told, had the gift of healing, if only he could get water to Diarmid. He had no water with him, but there was a well nearby. So he went to the well and he scooped up some water in his hands to take it to Diarmid. But as he approached him, he kept thinking of the elopement, and he opened his fingers and let the water trickle through. 3 times he did this, and on the 3rd occasion he held the water in his hands, but by that stage poor Diarmid had already died. So that is how Kinturk, the Hill of the Wild Boar, got its name. And I love the name of the well because it sums up the whole story. Death, revenge, atonement, guilt, indecisiveness, and the weakness of Finn's character. It's called Tubber na Moss Toll, the Well of the Leaking Hands.
The story of Lir's children who were turned into swans by a jealous stepmother is also a sad one. Tullynally, or the Hill of the Swan, is so called because it overlooks Derravara Loch, where the Swan children had to spend 300 years. That's round about the length of time that the castle's been here. The remarkable home of the remarkable Packenhams when we come back. I'm told there may have been a bit of one-upmanship rivalry between the Pollards of Castlepollard and their neighbours the Packenhams of Tullynally Castle, less than 2 kilometres out the road. If that was indeed the case, then the Packenhams, I have to say, have won hands down. The most recent addition to Tullynally Castle is the name itself. Packenham Hall, as it was known up until after the middle of the 20th century, was originally a 17th century square plantation house which accumulated towers and battlements over the years, just as the Packenham family accumulated wealth and titles by marriage and other means. The Packenham family tree fairly bristles with admirals, major generals, parliamentarians, barons, earls and other assorted peers. But it was Thomas Packenham, the second Earl of Longford, who went on a building spree in the early 1800s to create enduring splendour without and within. The word magnificent is often applied to the Great Hall, whose wonderful acoustic is renowned among concert-goers who like their music delivered amid timeless elegance and style. Magnificent is going to be overused here, I'm afraid, because it applies equally to the castle library and also to the gardens, more of which anon. But first, imagine seeing this place for the first time as a young adult and realising that this would be your home for the rest of your life. But you don't have to imagine. Valerie Packenham can describe that experience.
Without giving too much away, what year are we talking about?
Well, 1964. 1964, I got engaged to Thomas that spring. And so naturally I came here to check out what I was getting into. And so we came round the corner of this, after the avenue, and there was this enormous black monster of a house. And anyway, but actually, once I was inside it, it was incredibly friendly, nice house to be in. And we had, well, he had inherited a wonderful old lady called Mrs. Burke, who was the housekeeper here, who'd actually worked here from, I think, even before the First World War. She'd started off as a kind of girl of about 13, because people in those days started working very early. Yeah. And she'd sort of worked her way up from being the what's called sort of tweenie below stairs, and actually ended up being housekeeper, cook and everything, because by the time I got here she was the only survivor of the original household.
What kind of house had you grown up in yourself? Was it nothing on this scale, I assume?
No, well, I was brought up I was born in Kent. I was brought up in Hampshire. My father bought a farm after the war, just outside Basingstoke in Hampshire. And so we lived in a very large, extremely ugly house, sort of stockbroker Tudor house, which is just outside Basingstoke. And there was my father had a farm.
So you had been used to a house on a larger than normal scale, shall we say, but nothing like the scale of this.
Nothing like the scale of this.
Right. And that's part of the problem, wasn't it, in trying to live in a castle which had been designed for days when you had an army of servants.
Yes.
And most of the rooms were actually used, and here you had to sort of find a way of living in a place that was far too large.
I mean, this house is, I suppose because it started off being just a square block, and these wings were all added in the 1840s. Yeah. So in fact, it was quite easy to shrink back into the original 17th century house. Mm. And luckily, I say, we had this wonderful room, which became the kitchen, which is ideally placed. It had a back door. It had a door out to the garden very nearby. It had lots of sun coming in the windows in the morning, so you'd come down to breakfast in the sun. And anyway, I think it was the best choice we ever made, was to move the kitchen there. And so actually we haven't found it that difficult to live in this house. I mean, obviously there are bits of it that are freezing cold most of the winter because we don't heat them. But we have a very nice, really sort of suite of rooms, like a flat almost on the first floor, yes, with lovely views out of the windows. And then we just use the kitchen on the ground floor most of the time.
Was it a good place to bring up children as well?
Oh, wonderful. Well, partly because there were all these lovely, Mrs. Burke was a lovely old lady who you could leave a pram in the kitchen and she'd sort of look after the baby for you.
But when they got older...
And then when they were older, it was just wonderful to have all this space to run around.
You could lose them, couldn't you, easily?
Well, that was sometimes rather nice, wasn't it?
One of the rooms in which those children may well have lost themselves, in thought that is the castle library. A truly wondrous collection of volumes assembled over hundreds of years that is the envy of scholars and academics throughout the land. And one of the unique aspects of this collection is that the Packenhams themselves have been significant contributors to its shelves. Valerie Packenham, whom you've just met, has written a number of historical works on matters in which she has now acquired a unique personal insight. And one of those children we've referred to has now written a history of her own ancestors entitled Soldier Sailor. The next instalment of that history could well be called Author, because recent generations of Packenhams have unleashed a veritable tsunami of books upon the world. Time doesn't permit anything like an exhaustive list of the literary output of this family of historians, poets, playwrights and writers of one sort or another in the 20th century. So I'll simply focus on the man beside me, Thomas Packenham, prolific author, historian, tree lover and the proud owner of this library. He may not have read every book from cover to cover, he tells me, but he has recently catalogued 6,000 volumes and the inscriptions therein. The signature he encountered most frequently was that of the woman who married his ancestor Thomas Packenham in 1739, thus bringing into the family additional wealth, the title Baron Longford, and her very considerable collection of books. Her name was Elizabeth Cuff.
She was extremely well read, and lots of these books were her books, and have her name in, and you can follow through with her inscriptions in the title page of the book, starting as Elizabeth Cuff when she was a teenager. Books in Latin, books in Italian. She was an extremely clever girl, not just an heiress. And she had the title went with the family, the borough of Longford, and it really was the making of our family, that marriage. But the books come into it.
That's when the title came into the family as well. Now, you're entitled to use that title yourself. But you're entitled to use that title.
Well, would you want to be called Lord something?
Personally, I don't know, but I mean...
For me, it's an anachronism. For my generation, I think, and particularly in Ireland, I mean, I've got an Irish passport, I'm an Irish citizen. Anyway, I've never been tempted. I never felt I needed or wanted to add anything. I want to stay.
So you're plain Thomas Packenham?
Yes.
Right, okay. Your own books reflect different interests. I mean, you have a history of the Boer War and so on.
Yes. My first history book was a history of the 1798, the tragic, disastrous rebellion. And there were about 30 books in this library, which I found immensely useful, directly relevant to that.
You had serious, really good sources here, in other words.
Including Wolfe Tone's wonderful memoir, posthumous memoir, published in Philadelphia by his son and wife, I think, and with a scroll, unbound, straight from the publishers rather than bound in leather cover, with a scrawling Longford written across it. And I always assumed he read it with considerable distaste because that Lord Longford would have been pretty anti.
Well, jumping forward to your, I suppose your current passion and the one that's been bothering you for some time, and you've written books about trees, plants.
Yes, it's not just a current passion.
A lifelong one, then, is that the case?
Well, yeah, I think people often ask me, when did it start? And I say, well, I was brought up before the war, and in those days there were nannies and nurseries, and my elder sister and I who were less than a year apart. We're Irish twins, and we were brought down from the nursery after we'd had our baths, dressed up, hair washed, and there was our mother going out to party, looking and smelling absolutely like a goddess, and we were sat either side of our mother, and she read us a lot of wonderful books. I would say 3 years, 4 years, 5 years old, when we couldn't really read ourselves very well. And one of them was called The Wood That Came Back. And I think that book had a great effect on me, because it's about a wicked developer cutting the wood down and building a house, and then the wood coming back. The silly ass had forgotten that trees will grow back from the roots, and all the birds and animals that had been driven away, they all conspired to torment the family who built this house and the wood came back, and the family was driven shrieking away, and the trees grew again. So I think I'd always taken that in, rather, that I suppose trees were my heroes. But then the second thing was, when I was 27, I was working as a cub reporter in London in 1961, and my uncle dropped dead, the owner of this house, and it was left direct to me, bypassing my father, who didn't want to inherit. And I suddenly found on my plate this estate, 1,500 acres, wonderful but difficult, boggy land, but marvellous trees. And then I was responsible for the trees, so I had to learn about trees. So it wasn't a sort of purely romantic encounter.
Was it you who changed the name from Packenham Hall to Tullinally
Yes, that was
Castle?
one of my first decisions. I didn't like to share my name with a house. I much preferred the original Irish name, which is romantic, Tullinally, Hill of the Swan. I was criticised by some people for failing to change my name to Lord Silchester, which I would have been when my uncle died,
All right.
as the eldest son of my father, who had become Lord Longford. But I would have been Lord Silchester. And I failed to change my own name, but insisted on changing the name of the house. And so I got criticised both ways.
So you're a serial
I'm a
title
serial-
refuser.
Exactly.